Oh, so thank you all, and I would like to give the floor to Peter. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Anouk. Thank you very much, Martin, for this very warm welcome. First of all, let me share my screen. Then I can start with my presentation. So I hope every one of you can see the first slide of my presentation, which is kind of colorful. And yes, first of all, thank you very much for the possibility to present in front of you. I'm really happy that I can be part of such an really diverse group and very renowned scholars also in a panel afterwards. I'm really honored to give my first input talk before we get into the discussion. And I will present actually my research results from my PhD thesis, which I have conducted between 2014 and 2019 at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder at the German-Polish border. And that's actually the area where I was working and researching also until now. So after my work at the Viadrina Center Borders in Motion in Frankfurt-Oder, I have been working in this Leibniz Institute that Anouk just mentioned. And this institute is actually situated between the German-Polish border and Berlin. And right now, I am at the Brandenburg Technical University Cottbus-Senftenberg, which is actually an energy transition region close to Berlin and also in the German-Polish borderlands. So I'm actually pretty much still in the field of cross-border cooperation, Germany-Poland, but I have been also focusing pretty much on cross-border civil society and citizen participation in general, and also with a focus on legal instruments to empower cross-border cooperation, like the European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation, EGTC. So my presentation right now is, as I mentioned, about this book, this colorful book that I published this in the beginning of this year, and which is based on my PhD thesis. And my talk will have following structure. I will present my theoretical arguments. Then I move on to my analytical model that I developed within my thesis. I will talk a little bit about my research design. I will show my 4 case studies that I have conducted within my thesis, and I will show some results and outlook for the discussion. Before I start, I just want probably also to give a little bit framework about my understanding of citizen engagement in cross-border region, as I am a political scientist, and I am focusing pretty much on cross-border institutions. So I try to focus on citizen participation in cross-border regions, and also in institutional settings. So that's why I'm actually really curious about the discussion afterwards, because my colleagues in the panel discussions are pretty much experts also on democratic governance, but as I understand, more on the supranational or European level. European Parliament, referendum on a European level. So I'm really curious how we kind of match in a discussion and how we get together. Okay, then let me start with my theoretical argument of my thesis. So my research interest, as I was conducting actually my thesis in the context of cross-border cooperation and cross-border institutionalization, like through EU instruments like the EGTC, European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation. I was kind of bored about all these discussions about how to cooperate across borders. I was actually asking myself, I was thinking about the wider picture, about the European picture and all the crises that we faced when I started to write my thesis about 2015, 2016. And I was thinking at that time about the strengths and the achievements that actually the European Union achieved at that time. So I was thinking, there was a lot about this debate of reforming and democratization of EU politics. in times of crisis, I was focusing on the peculiarities and achievements of the EU. The EU, of course, is a system, a multi-level governance system with right now 27 countries, and a lot of languages. I think it's 24 languages all over the EU, 3 official languages. We have several regions, 300 regions. And we have also how I name it, the Europe of the cross-border regions, not only Europe of the regions, the cross-border regions. More than 150 euro regions, more than 180 EGTCs, a lot of funding and cooperation structures in the cross-border regions. That's why it's really potential in Europe. As you also see it in Maastricht, where you have 3 countries coming together, actually. I see these Europeanized border regions as resource of democratization, of EU politics and governance. So I am asking, actually, in my book and my thesis, I was asking how these citizens could be included, how these citizens and civil society could be included, and how it may result in innovative forms of participatory governance. So I was focusing actually I was trying to identify favoring factors participatory governance in EU cross-border regions. And that's why my research question was, which conditions favor the participation of civil society actors in sectoral or territorial subnational consultation and decision-making processes, governance as I frame it, in inner European border regions within the European Union? To answer this question, I was trying to link theories of political science, governance studies mainly, and from interdisciplinary borderland studies. When we try to apply the governance studies, I think most of you know it, most of you are also experts on it. We can divide between empirical, analytical stances who try to describe, for example, the European system, how it works, which actors, networks, cooperate, and so on, and normative ontological premises of governance, like, for example, democratic governance, like participatory governance, like, and so on. And I was, at that time, as I was focusing also on participation of civil society, of course, the notion of participatory governance came into my mind, and also into my, I applied this kind of concept, which I was actually deriving from German scholars like Kola Koch, Reinhold, but also Philipp C. Schmitter. Yeah, I tried to focus this participatory governance notion, which in EU studies and governance studies mostly applied on a supranational EU level. I tried to apply it on the subnational level in a cross-border dimension. And the other part and the other theoretical line, a theoretical stool, has been the borderland studies, which is a actually interdisciplinary field which came from the US and was focusing only on a US-American border, and it came in the 1980s to Europe, and a lot of geographers and historians and so on applied it. But I tried to link it with these governance studies, and I understand the national border is an enabling but also impeding condition. Of course, the border divides, but at the same time it can be used as a resource to link countries, to link jurisdictions, to link several different administrative apparatus and so on. And I actually also try to understand the border as a complex phenomenon. It's not only the hard static line in the country that divides, but it also has social cultural aspects, different historical aspects. We have socioeconomic differences, and you can feel the border in different dimensions. And I apply a model that has been developed by Beatrix Haselsberg in 2014, who speaks of a durability or permeability of national borders, which are determined by overlapping theme-specific boundaries, geopolitical, biophysical, sociocultural, and geopolitical boundaries that are situated like layers and define the thickness and the durability of a border. The thicker or the more durable a border, the more it is difficult for cross-border interactions to happen. So that's actually a really neo-functional understanding, but nevertheless, that actually served quite well to develop a hypothesis that I transferred afterwards into an analytical model. So my first hypothesis is for the following: border as a condition. The greater the degree to which nation-state borders are permeable in a geopolitical or socio-cultural context, the greater the degree to which participatory governance in EU CBRs cross-border regions will be in evidence. My second hypothesis is the effect of participatory governance. So why should citizens participate? And I say, or what I identified from the literature, the greater the degree of participation by civil society in cross-border governance arrangements, the greater the democratization of trans-border institutions and EU politics at the cross-border regional level can be witnessed. Combining both hypotheses, you can have this picture: the permeability of national borders as a condition for participatory governance in EU cross-border region as an outcome, and as an effect, democratization of EU politics on regional level. So this is really straightforward. This is really also a really functional understanding, but nevertheless, it helps pretty well to develop an analytical model that I will show you the next step. So it gets more complex now. This is actually the same logic of causal logic, starting with the condition side of permeability of nation-state borders. We have two different independent variables that define the permeability of the nation-state border. There's the geopolitical boundaries and socio-cultural boundaries, deemed specific boundaries. This is actually based and modified on the model from Haselsberger that I just mentioned before. So it's inspired by her model, and I just applied it for my specific case and re-elaborated a little bit more. To define the geopolitical boundaries in a cross-border region, I've been focusing on territorial organization, paradiplomacy and regionalization, supremacy and statehood. To define the social-cultural boundaries, I was focusing on membership control, maintenance of commonalities, and protection of collective memory. That sounds still a little bit, maybe it needs to be more explained, but I think I have not so much time in this half an hour, so probably we can leave it also for the discussion. That's my idea, and we can go on this. But the more territorial organization, the more paradiplomacy, for example, exists, the less geopolitical boundaries are evident, and the more permeability and the more participatory governance is expected. And I divide, that's a typical political science division, I divide participatory governance in 3 levels as well, which is polity, politics, and policy. Polity are the actors and the structures of a political system, of institution, for example. Politics are the processes, and policy are the contents. So what I mean, participation of civil society is possible in its actors and structures, it's possible in processes, and it's possible in contents on a specific law or specific cross-border strategy and so on. So that's the idea behind it. And the effects, okay, that's from the literature: democratization of EU politics, innovation of governing, legitimacy of EU politics, but also negative effects could be expected of participatory governance, because in some democratic governance literature, it says that people don't have the resources, the time, the capacity, and so on to really participate. And in certain conditions, only those who have money and so on could really have the resources to participate in certain aspects, like lobbying groups and so on. But that's another point, and probably also for discussion. So that's the analytical model that I tried to apply, and maybe a little bit more about the research design. I told you in the beginning, probably you remember, that I tried to use it in the context of a cross-border instrument project, which is the EGTC, European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation. So that's why I applied my analytical model to these cross-border institutions. There exist more than 80. Also, a Euro region has this legal form. And yes, that's what I analyzed. The methods, I've used qualitative analysis, comparison, in-depth case studies. I made an X-centered analysis, which means I focused on the conditions, on the geopolitical, social, cultural boundaries. And I also had an explorative process analysis. I conducted semi-structured expert interviews of EGTCs, of the EGTC representatives and EU institutions. I talked with representatives of the Commission, of the Committee of the Regions, and of the European Parliament. And I had 4 EGTC case studies that I will present in a minute. So the next slide, please don't be, please don't feel overwhelmed by the next slide. It will be a huge table that I will present you, but we will move through the table in the next minute. So I hope you can see what is standing there. Yeah, it's a little bit small, but actually that's more or less the results of my thesis. You can also find it in my book in the last chapter, or pre-last chapter. And actually, but this slide shows pretty well more or less the research results. So first of all, you can see 4 EGTC case studies that I conducted. That's on the top. I was focusing on the Spanish, Portuguese, Galician, Norte de Portugal EGTC. I've been focusing on Tyrol, South Tyrol, Trentino, Austria, Italy, and the Euro district Sarmoselle. And a Trans-Urana EGTC, which is actually has not been founded, but at that time when I conducted interviews, it was actually planned to be an EGTC, and it actually came from a citizen initiative. So that's actually the other way around. The citizens started to try to build up an EGTC, but they failed because administrative aspects. But as you can see, I was analyzing the EGTC. That's in the first row. In the first part. Then the CBR means cross-border regions. I was focusing on the duration, how long the cross-border region has been active in the European Union context. I've been focusing on when it entered, for example, the Schengen area. And you could also already see that, for example, the German-Polish, of course, has a shorter history in the European integration context, as Poland joined in the 2000s, actually, to most of the European contracts. You can also see that I was focusing on the different bilateral national cooperation treaties. Going to the next, that's the second part of the table, but then it's actually over. You can see here the results of my analysis, which are really, I think, really broad, but I think in the next slides, I will show you some highlights of my results, and then it gets more clear, I think, to you. You can see here, I was focusing on different geopolitical boundaries. In every single border region, different boundaries exist. And also with the social, cultural boundaries, language, history, culture, you can see here, of course, different aspects in every border region. And the bottom part of the table is on participatory governance, the results on it. So I was actually focusing first also on the general civil society organizations in both countries, which are very different, of course. Germany is a really country of associations. A lot of associations exist, and different kinds of organization of civil society, of course, in both countries. And also what we can also see, we have different ways of participation and different border actor categories in each border region that participate on several occasions. So that's probably a broad overview, and now I will give you some more results of my presentation. This chart looks also a little bit confusing. What this tried to say is actually I wanted to try to elaborate on the causal relations that I mentioned in the theoretical part. And here I tried to build up a causality between the permeability of the border, of the national border, and the manifestation of civil society participation. And here I will go on the results, and then I'm actually finishing my presentation. Not sure how I'm on time. Okay, I'm quite
very good.
Fine.
Excellent.
Very good. Okay, I think I have 3 more slides or 4. On the results, first of all, you remember my 3-step causal model. I will give you some insights from main results from the permeability of the border. So first of all, I would not say I could identify a really causality between permeability at the border and civil society participation. Rather, I would say I see a correlation between the permeability of the border and participatory governance in 3 or 4 EGTC case studies. Regarding my classification and my operationalization that I did not show you, but we can also probably go into this to the discussion, I have identified one very permeable border, which is the Galician North Portuguese border. I identified a permeable border in the Euro district Saar-Moselle in South Tyrol, Trentino, and a durable border in the German-Polish area, because in these areas we identified mainly really geopolitical boundaries, but also, of course, with regards to social-cultural context, also the German-Polish border is considered to be a really difficult one. The geopolitical and social cultural borders are in relation, so there's nothing surprise. So geopolitical measures could, of course, be a result of social cultural developments and so on. And another interesting aspect, what I saw quite often, especially it's actually quite visible in the German-Polish case as well, is that the de- and rebordering processes on national, subnational level are sometimes divergent, which means in some national context, the binational relations between 2 countries could be really difficult and no cooperation or really little cooperation exists. While on the subnational level, the cooperations get even stronger in that time. So that's one aspect that I could see in this result. With regards to participatory governance, I could identify one case study, the participatory governance, to be most significant, which is the EGTC Tyrol, South Tyrol, Trentino case study, which was really good in politics, policy, and polity. In every of these 3 dimensions, they have good results. Several actors from civil society, cultural, and so on integrated. Actually, a citizen council has been in, that was actually after my thesis as well, but I think in this year or last year it was installed. So also in the EGTC, so there's a really good structure. Only few EGTCs have this kind of structure, and it's an frequent exchange actually, and through the citizen council actually also decision-making process, not only opinion formation but also decision-making processes are integrated. The regular exchange is what I just mentioned in different formats. We have not only within the EGTC, but they also have Euro Academia, they have pupil labs and so on. So really pretty much formats in the also education and health sector, and also in the art and culture sector. And conditions for that, is of course sometimes a little bit difficult, but In both regions, the socioeconomic standard is quite high, in Austria, in North Italy, and they have little asymmetries or small border. Also regarding autonomy, both states, the federal state of Tyrol in Austria has a high autonomy, and the northern state of Bolzano, Alto Adige, has also a high autonomy provided by the Italian state. And of course, you could also discuss it from the angle of cross-border regional identity, as Tyrol has been a joint region until 1980. So on democratization, as I mentioned, I have conducted an X-centered analysis, so mainly focusing on the border dimensions and participatory governance, but also democratization. I would say civil society participation was irregular in most cases and on the point. So the civil society was mainly integrated when long-term consultations were conducted. For example, on action plans, typical cross-border institutions of action plans for the next 5, 7, or 10 years. So that's where civil society organization and citizens were integrated to give their voice. Another aspect, of course, are thematic working groups. And more also citizen councils are getting integrated. But at that time when I conducted my study, actually not so many have been there. So I cannot tell you so much about this if you're interested in this, but probably we have other experts who could tell you something about this. In all cases, participatory governance was rather an opinion formation than decision-making, as I just mentioned. And a broad spectrum of policy ambits have been favorable for participatory governance. Another aspect, what I saw is that the interest of the citizens, as you know, is sometimes not as high as we want it to be in the border regions. But what we saw was actually in the last years, also with the Corona crisis now, is that the cross-border public services are getting more and more important. So not only citizens that are active and try to change the cross-border region, but also how to provide services for the citizens in health, education, transport, and so on, is getting more and more important in the last years. So that's nearly the last slide. Just probably, as you were seeing, my model is really straightforward, and this is really has a kind of a functional approach. But there are, of course, other conditions that favor participatory governance in cross-border regions, not only the border dimension, the geopolitical and socio-cultural, but also other aspects that my interview partners mentioned that are really important. Of course, trust. Probably most of you know the 25 years Interreg cake graphic, where trust is the first layer. And it's actually probably here the same, that trust is really important. Legal groundwork, political will as well. Political will actually also to open up. But of course, you could also prolong the list and give further examples. So this is probably to end my presentation, and that's why I say thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion and to the whole debate today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. And probably I also can tell a few more words about you, because the great thing is that it's not the first time that we cooperate. You are also doing with us the cross-border impact assessment this year for the second time, and you are a member to the TINE network. So we have a lot of contacts, and this is now, of course, a very good occasion also to go into the details of your research and discuss that. From my point of view, I found extremely interesting to see that the Tyrol example is of course on top. In our region, probably you don't know that we also have here a divided region, Limburg, where we have a Belgian and a Dutch part. So you could also say probably, that would be then a first idea, the conditions could be excellent also for the cross-border cooperation between a region that was historically more or less the same geographical or in political region. But we will come to that. In the first place, I would like to invite Christine Neuhold. She's a professor of EU democratic governance. And Christine, of course, in the first place, the EU as such is always seen as very far away from the citizen. That's a stereotype, more or less, also very often at the national level. Yet these bureaucrats in Brussels, they are so far away from the real people. Probably we can also say that about the cross-border region, this very strange animal Euro region is also a thing not a lot of people understand. So if you compare that, what is at the moment, what you think the situation of the citizen in the whole EU governance framework? We are dreaming, of course, of the future of Europe and the participation of citizens, but is there such a thing as a European citizen?
Okay, thank you so much. That's the $100 or $1,000 question. I mean, is there such a thing as an EU citizen? I would rather like to rephrase the question because, I mean, whether there's an EU citizen or not, that's all about, that would lead us into the debate of EU identity and different demoi and this whole debate. But if we look at what Peter Ulrich has done, and I really would like to applaud you for writing such a nice book, it's more about how can the EU citizen, how can the ordinary citizen, whatever we understand, participate in EU governance. And this has been keeping the EU busy ever since the Maastricht Treaty. And if you look at the Maastricht Treaty itself, here we also see that European citizenship was actually enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty, and then civil society actually, and there also we might need a definition of what we mean by this, and this is also a very contested concept in the literature, but civil society really went through a remarkable career. But what we do see, and that's your question about participation, what you do see, and we also heard that to some extent from Peter, is that at least at the beginning, for instance, the Commission had online consultations, etc. And here we see that, and the literature is very critical about this. They talk about an empowered elite of stakeholders, and they also talk about opaque instruments. So it's a very negative verdict when it comes to the participation of an ordinary citizen. The literature concedes, however, that there's more of a plurality of opinions, so more voices can feed into policy making, and also that the role of business has been pushed somewhat aside. When we then see, you know, so I've talked about the Maastricht Treaty, and then we see what happened in the Lisbon Treaty. So I've said before, you know, it has been keeping the EU busy. In the Lisbon Treaty, we see that participatory democracy, and that maybe alludes again to your question about the citizen. Participatory democracy became even more salient, and Peter already alluded to it, European Citizen Initiative, but here's a similar verdict, yeah? So here the verdict is, first of all, we talked about opaque instruments. Here it's very bureaucratic instruments, and very difficult to organize the citizens' initiative, little impact on actual EU policy. So we also have to look at what happens with the input of citizens of civil society. And then also hardly any of the citizens' initiatives actually made it. So there were very high expectations, but someone wrote a paper saying a lot of thunder, little rain, yeah? So maybe we don't want the rain, but there is little impact. And then to come to your question, I mean, so the European Union seems to have learned from this, also saying, okay, it's very much about organized civil society. So your citizen doesn't really feed into policymaking. It's NGOs that are well organized. It's still business interests, possibly, et cetera, et cetera. So now, on the when we look at the conference on the future of Europe, we really see, okay, we really want the real citizen, yeah, as if they were an unreal citizen. But we want, yeah, to increase the input of citizens' voices, and we will randomly select citizens for these different panels that feed into the conference on the future of Europe. And we already see that these panels have taken place and are taking place. The next one is taking place, as we discussed informally, of course, in January in Maastricht. And I think it's a very good idea to actually say, okay, we really try to randomly select. But then I think the proof of the pudding is always in the eating, of course. And there are mechanisms foreseen, but what then actually happens with all this input? And how, and this it's too early to tell. So we have mechanisms that are foreseen that this feeds into conference plenary, but what at the end of the day actually trickles down, and where does this end up? But we do see, and that's also something to feed back into the research of Peter Ulrich, we do see that the European Union seems to take this participatory democracy notion very seriously. So different attempts have been made, and we see also fine-tuning over time since the Maastricht Treaty. And now we really see, okay, we want to have citizens participate in policymaking.
Thanks a lot. And perhaps one last question with respect to then also the link between the EU dimension and the cross-border dimension. I mean, Peter said also that what's happening in a cross-border territory, and also whether you can there have decent participation, is also a bit a proof of the pudding for the whole of the EU. So would you also say that it's extremely important that people in cross-border regions have also the idea that they have a say also with respect to what is happening in cross-border cooperation?
Yeah, a very nice question. I think for me, cross-borders are, yeah, if you so will, biotopes of the European Union, because you really have citizens interacting across different countries. So I think it is extremely important to have these notions of participatory governance and of cooperation. But when reading, and that's the question that I have for Peter Ulrich, it's a bit what drives the European Union since several decades. Citizen participation seems to be equated with democracy. Yeah, so if we involve the citizens, then kommt gut, everything will be fine somehow. Yeah, so we have these very positive normative assumptions about citizens' involvement. And we've seen in the European context that this is not always the case. So my question was also to Peter, because I also read that very explicitly in your thesis. How can we be so sure? And what do you think more personally? You've been through this whole trajectory of your research. Do you see that critically as well, that this is not per se an equation, citizens' participation across borders or elsewhere, and more democracy?
You refer to the change of the summertime. That was a citizens' initiative, and we are not really sure whether that makes sense or not. Peter, please.
Yeah, well, that's a very good and important question, and I am not sure if I can answer it in that way, in the best way, I think, because as you could see in my presentation, this 3-step, I was saying I was focusing on this condition side and on participatory governance, so the way how how governance is linked, or how civil society is linked with, and the effects. Your question, from Christine Heuer-Hoyt, is of course about the effects, I think, and the positive assumption. So the other point, I started also pretty much from this normative dimension. I also applied pretty much literature from democratic theory and so on. And you're absolutely right that I started really with this normative assumption. I also had some critical remarks on it, but I tried to make this normative, and then I tried to link it to the cross-border dimension. And what I could, for example, also see from other studies on a supranational level, European level. So that's mainly when we talk about participatory democracy, also from this, mostly these online consultations. You're absolutely right that I think that has been pretty much criticized several ways. There are, I think, several publications. That's actually where it came from, my idea with the stakeholder governance, the critical points where, for example, online consultations from some DGs who try to ask about a certain aspect that sometimes the normal citizen don't have the time, don't have the capacities to really participate, and other lobby groups probably take over who have the resource and so on and participate. And that's the online consultation, supranational. The other point is the ECY, so I think it's called, right, the European Citizen Initiative, which is from the Lisbon Treaty. And I'm not sure about the actual state of the art nowadays, but when I started to write my thesis, there have been some initiatives in the beginning where it has been a little bit complicated with regards to when you had, for example, the minimum of the 1 million signatures from at least 1/4 of the countries, so 7 countries, and then you hand it into the commission, then sometimes they were rejected for the reason that there is already some regulation, or it's not in the competences of the commission and so on. So this could be seen also a little bit critical to some point, but nevertheless, I think it's also actually a point that I would not criticize so much, but what I can see in the European Union in general is that there are several forums where actually citizens could participate directly or indirectly. Of course, I think you are expert on the European Parliament, so I won't talk so much about this, but European Parliament, of course, is where the citizens are represented. And also in the Council of Ministers or the European Council, there are also indirectly the votes of the citizens for those who represent their countries, and so on. And also in the Council of Committee of the Regions, there's also kind of representatives of the region. So direct or indirect possibilities. But now coming back to my level, to my subnational level, what I see is that the cross-border regions need to really be strengthened more. There's a really lot of potential. We have, there's always this statistics of 30% and 40%, I think, territory and 30% of citizens who live there. So a huge capacities. We have also a lot of cross-border commuters in all over Europe, also in your region, in a greater region around Luxembourg, for example. But at the same time, we still have national logics, and we have also a little knowledge of citizens about EU-funded projects, about cooperation structures and projects. The European Union publishes every 5 years a EU barometer on citizen awareness on Interreg funds or something like this. And it's always since 2010, 2015, and the last one, it's always about only 25–30% know only that there are cross-border cooperation structures, that are projects, there are funds that could actually be also applied to people-to-people projects. So I think okay, that's probably a recommendation from the 90s or beginning of the 2000s. But I think communication is a really important aspect, and you have to say it again and again and again, because you have to always make it transparent how citizens can participate. And you said it, Casino had it really a good point with the bio, I think you said, of EU integration. And I actually I see that Karl-Heinz Lamberts is here, and I've been to a conference, and Mr. Lamberts, you were quoted yesterday that you said one day that border regions are actually places where the people were standing back to back, and you have to turn around and to face each other. And I think it's a really good picture, and that's actually what needs to be done more. I think it's really big potential to use it as a resource to democratize bottom up the European Union. So.
But Peter, that is of course a bit against your idea of we are already in the EU of the border regions. So the EU of the border regions, that is more or less on our wish list. That's the vision in the future. I'm happy to have Joost van der Akker with us, because he is also, you could say, a practitioner with respect to governance and government, because he has been for the last couple of years also an executive. He was the regional minister for economic affairs here in our region, in our province of Limburg. And he was also a member of our regional parliament, but he's also a scientist who wrote his PhD on referenda at the EU level. So there are three different perspectives probably. Joost, when you were gedeputeerde, the regional minister, what was your impression of citizens' participation? Was it possible across the border? Did you there experience positive elements?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. As a member of the executive board, citizen participation cross-border honestly was hardly discussed and debated. Before, the provincial parliament participated in the transition from the EU-region Maas-Rhine into a European grouping of territorial cooperation. So other regions than Peter Ulrich discussed in his fine and great work. But after that change, that transition into an EGTC, an adventure as it was called on the website of the Euro region Maas-Rhine, hardly anything has been heard, I think. Probably unfortunately, but also probably because the trajectory machine is working as it should by Interact and people-to-people projects. However, what has been emerging on the regional level is discussion on cross-border issues. I remember, for example, the chain-like demonstration from Aachen to Liège about closing the nuclear power plant of Tihange, or the public nuisance of airports from Liège or Maastricht. So on more environmental issues, people may hurt themselves, but they don't organize that along cross-border polities, as Peter Ulrich would call it. Mm-hmm. Moreover, and that's final point, also citizen participation within the province of Limburg has unfolded into several initiatives. Let me shortly list them. For the kids at school, there's the so-called Statenspel, where primary school kids can get into the way of how regional politics work, getting familiar with parties, diverging visions, debates, limited budget, and so on. That's one item. Second, there's the Citizens Initiative at regional level, but it has not been used. 1,500 signatures are needed for that, but it has not been used. Third, there has been the pilot of the Citizens Summit, the Burgertop, in 2018, but I doubt whether it has been, its advices have been really implemented. It got stuck actually this year and last year also in the province's budget. And finally, there has been a revised referendum regulation where citizens can correct the decisions taken by the provincial assembly, which has been revised last year on my initiative, but there has not been a referendum on provincial level in the Netherlands yet.
Okay, so there is a lot going on, more or less, and you could say that there is now also a lot of experience with different instruments of citizens' participation. But there is my problem a bit. If you say participation, you also have to explain to what, and is that decision making, and citizens participate in order to consult the people who make decisions. So what is your impression in a Euro region as we have here? Is there such a thing as decision making? Is there also, you can say yes, and that's why we invite citizens, because we know there are decisions to be made and we would like to consult the people. What type of decisions are there?
Yeah, that was actually my kind of dream when I was a member of regional parliament myself, that was, okay, we have this regional council which can give decisions or advice about what decisions to be taken at your regional level. But since there is no kind of, as Peter Ulrich would call it, symmetrical identity or regional identity, and there's huge asymmetrical decision making, federal and non-federal political systems, the way decisions are prepared and thought of and thought about is not in a cross-border level, not in a cross-border way. And despite the EGTC, I don't think that has changed, because there's simply not this regional identity, not in a formal way, but let alone in a more mental way. Think only of for example, language differences. However, that has also to do with the way the European Union is founded. And also a good friend of mine in this call, Jaap Hoeksma, gave some input, and he said, let's have a look at the treaty articles. And if we look at the EU treaty articles, it already says in Article 1 and Article 10 that the Union, that the decision should be taken as closely as possible to the citizen, but that the Union is founded on representative democracy, and that the European Parliament represents at European level. So direct democracy, way for referendums at European level, it's not the first road to take for decision making at EU level. So then putting in this participatory democracy, it's always the second best attempt, I would say.
Mm. And from your experiences, complexity, is that also a condition that could hamper or prevent us from having more participation? Because our Euro region is, of course, with 3 member states and 5 regions, a very complex construction.
Yeah, it definitely hampers. And I think the fact that it has different cultural and historical backgrounds compared to, for example, Tyrol and South Tyrol, makes that in the minds of citizens and also in the minds of elected politicians, there's no self-evident objective to create policies and polities in a regional setting.
Yeah, that's the question. Where is the place where decisions are made? And if you talk, for instance, about budgets, that's made by Interreg, and not even the Euro region as such is there the decision maker if it's about more or less the financial instrument that is very important for cross-border cooperation. I guess also that is a problem.
Well, yeah, I think that the Euro region organization is very functional. It is there to make these kind of projects work, which work in themselves, cross-border mobility on labor market, on infrastructure, on environment. Of course, the realization, think about direct connections, train connections between Liège and Maastricht, or the tram connection between Maastricht and Hasselt. Of course, it's a different item, but it has mostly to do also with the very nationalized structures of the real decision makers. And those are, for example, the Dutch and Belgian national railway agencies and national ministers of infrastructure, who don't always prove their real interest in cross-border cooperation.
Yes, and very often also a common language does not really help, as we see from the Limburg example. I have not the idea that the cooperation with the Belgian Limburg is so much better than with the German side. So language probably is sometimes not the only thing that really improves things. So Hildegard, I would like to also invite Hildegard. Is she here in the?
Yes.
Yeah, hello Hildegard. Hildegard Schneider, who is more or less the founder of ITEM, I could say, and for the last couple of years, we have looked into many, many different aspects of cross-border cooperation. That's why also to you the question, is there such a thing as a EU-regional citizen, EU citizen, but also a cross-border citizen? And if there is one, what is your idea how to better involve people in cross-border regions?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Peter, that you present your book here, because it was really a pleasure to see your book in real, and also because I have seen it growing in the tough time, and it has really grown to a really big book. So from that perspective, also congratulations with your book. I'm in the university at the moment because I was teaching and I didn't realize. So I hope the lights are all right. And to listen to me. Now, yes, to answer Martin's question, I was at a meeting, or actually it was a talk of a very old lady from Hungary, and she with students, and she said, there is not something like a European citizen. I would love that there is, but there isn't. And then a lot of students stood up and said, no, in Maastricht, we really have the feeling that we study together and we are European citizens. But we have one problem, and I think that's also some problem which we have precisely in the border region. Issue of the European Parliament was already mentioned. I still think it's a missed chance that we do not have really elections, neither to the European Parliament with common parties and also with the same election system for all, and also not in a regional issue, because I think I think participatory governance, but also participation really in political decision making would be much improved if the people in the region would be able to vote together with a list where they can vote to, first also to the European Parliament. I would say that's one of the missed chances. I mean, we talk about this since '79, and I think we will not manage it until the next European Parliament election. But if we would be able to found something that a regional parliamentary, like, let's say in southern Germany, we have the Kreise. So if we could have a election campaign together, where also, let's say the money on Interreg would be really divided by some body who is elected by the regional by the regional people, I think that would really give the feeling of being, how do you call it, Martin, a regional citizen? Because no, yes, if there is no really reason why you would do it, I think people do not consider to be feeling to be engaged in such a polity at all. And that, I think, and of course, Corona has an enormous influence to our region because the border was closed and really closed. Now, I have two questions to Peter. Is the participation in the, what you call the softer region, or where the softer border is, for European parliamentary election, and also in when you have a Eurostat questionnaire concerning, do you know the region and how do you feel in the region, etc. Is that better, let's say, in Tyrol and South Tyrol than in, let's say, at the Polish-German border? Is the language, because language was already mentioned, nevertheless a reason why it is perhaps easier that people communicate and are having a common history? And how is it then with the French-German border, where I think there is a strong connection between each other? So this, I would be more practical questions. Do people consider them more as a European citizens because they have a softer border, or is it no difference to that from that perspective? And then another question I have, because I have some prejudice against the instrument, let's say, I find it not the most easy instrument to be used. And from that perspective, do we not need easier instruments for cooperation in the future?
Thanks a lot, Hildegard. Peter, please.
Yeah, well, big questions again. So first of all, yeah, I had this in the model. I had this causal relation, open border, the more interaction across border. That's a really easy understanding and reduction of complexity, I would say, but it helped me to make an analysis. And in the analysis, I realized, no, it's not like this. It's a mixed picture. Not the more open the border is, the more it means automatically that there is more cross-border interaction or more European citizen feeling or anything like this. Of course, these there are always boundaries that have an impact. The question sometimes is which boundary has the most impact on the cross-border interaction, and I think, or which makes the boundary, the border thicker for cross-border Europeanness or whatsoever. And I think I can best speak about the German-Polish border. Maybe I could take this as an example because I know it the best. We have in this border region, we have huge asymmetries in several occasions. Of course, the historical conflicts that exist. This border actually, if you want to say it, please don't understand me wrong, but it's also kind of an artificial border in that case, that it has been shifted several times in history. And since 1950, it was accepted by the GDR, and since 1990 by the Federal Republic of Germany and international law. So of course, also through this new settle of the border, it has been, of course, a resettlement of the population as well in the border region, which had some impacts in the years after the Second World War, and also many prejudices and many difficulties. That's the historical point. The other point is that we have huge linguistic asymmetry. A lot of Polish people actually learned German. And only few people, also me actually, I work on that. My Polish skills are not that good. I'm still learning, progressing, but it's still not so good that I can have a really good talk. Just the basics. So still, there's a lot of things to do. I think also the federal states on the German side try to push it. A lot of offers now Polish courses in schools, and I think it's getting closer and closer. And that's why I think there's a lot of things to do. And one of the elements that I identified in this geopolitical boundary dimension was actually also this point of paradiplomacy and regionalization. So what I can see when you compare the German-Polish to the German-French border, for example, you see that with the Élysée Treaty of 1963 between Germany and France, you had several exchange occasions. You had several things and the citizens got to know each other more years than a German-Polish border, where actually it started in 1990, really good exchange. Of course, there have been in the 80s some points where a little bit exchange has been, but in the 70s, sorry, but mainly in the 1990s. So I think an important issue is also the contact in the European context, in the cross-border context where a cross-border region can grow together. And I think this is a really important aspect that I also saw in my study. That's the first, I think, more or less. I hope I answered it. Yeah. And the second one, EGTC, yeah, that's an European cross-border instrument introduced in 2006. It's kind of complicated, but at the same time, it shall mitigate complexity at the same time. I think the implementation process is difficult and long-term. It can take 1 or 2 years in some cases, sometimes a little bit longer. But then I think most of the institutions that I've talked to afterwards, they were really satisfied with this cross-border structure. It gives you an European label. It gives you more capacity to act in a certain senses, and you are also organized on European level as well in this EGTC platform in some case. I think
sorry to interrupt, but you nevertheless, and I saw it also in your examples, there has to be a choice made on the law applicable. So yes, in the end, there is French law, Polish law. I think the Italian chose for Italian law. So in the end, there's a choice of law, and that makes it already not a European instrument to some extent, because you will have to make this choice of law.
You have to choose the law. That's correct. You have to define it. It's also a politics of choosing the law, the seat, and where the law is applicable. But you could also make how to say. Oh, damn it! The word examples, not examples, exceptions. That's the word.
Right.
Oh, exceptions. There are exceptions that you could also say, okay, the labor law is from the German side, for example, or this specific law is applied. So you could also build a little bit up your law, although, of course, the seat law is actually the one that's bring. But I think there are also revisions, reforms. In 2013, there's been a reform, and the EGTC could also conduct, for example, cross-border public services. And that's also, I think, an important aspect. So also, even in the German-Polish border, there will be an EGTC actually soon. It looks like this. So it was a really complicated case, border region, a lot of difficulties, but probably there will be one in next year in the beginning. So also there starts.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I would also like now to open up the questions to the audience. If you just put your questions in the chat, then I can also look whether it fits into the debate. And I think, Christine Neuwold, I think you have to leave now. You told me earlier. So thanks a lot for your contributions, and see you next time with our next item. So I would also like to also discuss an idea that was presented by Hildegard, but also by Herr Esses in the chat. What about citizens' budget? That this is now also an instrument that is at a local level very often now applied to give the floor to citizens if it's about budgetary decisions. And of course, are there possibilities? Is there the idea that you could do that also with Interreg money and bring together citizens from both sides of the borders, or three sides of the borders? At the moment, I mean, it's the governments, they sit in the Interreg committee together, regions, ministries, and they more or less then make a deal about the investments together with the European Commission. So is there the idea that you could do that also with the involvement of citizens? Who wants to, Joost, perhaps from your experience also with Interreg?
Yes, you may, as long as, of course, the choice to reserve a particular part of the Interreg budget for these kind of projects up to a selection of citizens or a proposal by citizens, because from the point of legitimacy, of course, it is vital that those who are representing the citizens, the members of parliament, or representing the government, can take accountability for the way taxpayers' money has been spent, be it at local or at European level. At the moment, of course, the selection committee takes into account all different kinds of aspects, and also that's organized at a lot of different ways. However, not asking directly the citizens what they think about these projects. I have also a question regarding that to Peter, because he said about his causal link, that if there are more open borders and more participatory government, this also helps democratization of EU politics at EU level. But since we're just talking about cross-border, I would say micro-level issues, how does this help the larger EU decision making?
Shall I answer directly?
Yes,
Martin?
please.
Yes,
please.
Well, I think I just can answer really quickly. I see that the border regions are the fundamentals of the European Union. I actually also like the concept. Also, it's really how to say, it's probably not really realistic these days, but I like the concept of Europe of regions. That's why I also with the Europe of cross-border regions. Where the regional level or the local level is connected with the European level. And And that's why I think it's that's the basis actually for also democratizing the European Union. It could be a point, but I think I had a discussion with Martin before that session, and I think we were talking about this as well a little bit, and I think this cross-border participation in indirect funds, for example, or budgeting, that could be one possibility, but that's only an additional way of participate because the citizens in general, of course, we still have national systems and we have national or regional regions. These elements or these forums are of course important as well, and the citizens need to feel also integrated and included there as well. And I think this cross-border level is an additional layer of where citizens could participate. But in general, I think this could help to also strengthen the European Union, but it needs to be communicated as well. As I said in the beginning, you need to communicate about the possibilities over and over again.
And perhaps then we have to discuss also about discuss the crisis of the border regions, because then that would mean that we also have a sort of crisis of European integration, if there is a connection. Hildegard, you would like to comment?
On the European level, yes. Yeah. On the European level, I think one of the problems is also that the DGs don't work very closely together. I don't see much cooperation between, for example, DG Regio and DG Just, where European citizenship is the issue in DG Just. For DG Just, the European citizen is just the big picture. So it doesn't matter whether you come across the border from Romania to Brussels or from wherever. While if you look, DG Region is different. Now, if one would have projects together, and really, as you mentioned, the 30% and 40%, and I also forget always which one is which, but it's important and it shows it's big. If that would be taken more into account together, I think then also, perhaps because I have to give input for the citizens report once after a while for DG Just, I never had the feeling that they really had a view on the regional perspective. And I think that's a big issue for the European level. If the regions are sort of micro-European integration, and that takes place, then in my opinion, also on European level, this should be put together, or at least in certain projects, to understand the problem for the frontier workers, for the people living in the region, for the European citizens who face European integration on a daily level. And I think that's very often overlooked if I take the other DGs, whether it's employment or grow or just.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. I have seen Jakub has made a comment that it would be good to have more platforms for civic participation in the border region. And of course, I think as Joost said, at the moment, more or less, also our EGTC is a bit more functional. I think there are also representatives of, I think, labor associations or also enterprises in the assembly, but of course it is rather weak. And we had in the past Regiorat, a council, but there the problem was that it was not clear what they really do there, because there was no real decision making. So it was also difficult to have their representatives because there were no decisions to be made. I would like to come now really to the question of the crisis, because in my view, after my research on the corona crisis in our border region, I have the idea that the border regions are in crisis, and that that's why also a crisis of the Europe of the border region, because especially also the trust in the open border is really jeopardized by what happened. So my question is, I mean, we have now, for instance, an instrument like the Citizens Assembly, where you bring together randomly 50, 60 or 100 citizens in order to talk about very important aspects. Would it make sense now, after the corona crisis, to say also in our border regions, we need such a citizen assembly in order to look into the future of our Euro region and discuss how can we make sure that solidarity is also taking place in times of crisis? Hildegard, would you like to organize a citizens assembly, or do you think that would be an added value?
I would like to have a meeting with during the parliamentary elections to have really a good discussion from a regional perspective. That I really would like to have. I'm not sure whether it will really help for the decision and for the participation, but I would hope, and I don't think it's the case, that people who are so closely involved in border regions would participate more in the European Parliament, because then they have direct influence on the main decision making.
Okay, yes.
But I doubt it actually, and I would have to look in the figures whether there's a higher participation. That's what I wanted to know also from Peter, whether he has the feeling that there's a higher participation in the border region. I have my doubts.
No.
I must say my connection might stop suddenly because I see I have forgotten to take my plug with me, so I have to change to the phone, I guess.
No problem.
So if I gone, I come back.
You have energy problems, yes. Joost, you wanted to.
Yeah, very short.
Comment.
I don't think that the citizen dialogue should be established. However, what we see in the discussion to the upcoming conference on the future of Europe, at least the Dutch government and the Dutch social cultural planning agency, Sociaal Cultural Planbureau, is being checking whether citizens like the so-called citizens forum. And the question remains, okay, how to organize and how to secure the representation of the participants, because they are taken by lottery. But these experiences of citizens forums in the United States, for example, also I think they will find their ways to local and even national democracy. So it might also be an idea to experiment at the regional level, not to replace those who are elected, not to replace the members of the European Parliament indeed, but as an additional platform.
But to come back to my question with respect to the crisis, you are more or less also familiar with the political debate around, for instance, in our province of Limburg. Do you think that politicians or members of the regional parliament have the idea that there is a sort of crisis of our cross-border cooperation after Corona?
No, and they did care, but they could not care enough because they didn't have a mandate to solve. And the closing of borders was a decision taken by the mayors, the Minister of Justice of one country, the minister and the mayors of other countries, and those locally represented could not change anything of it. So probably it was not perceived as their crisis, but the crisis created by necessary measures by national governments.
Yes, of course, that's what we found, and we even found that it was unfortunate that national steering, very often crisis management, prevented good cooperation across the borders. If we look into hospital cooperation, for instance, it was a bit sad that we had very good networks, but they could not operate across the border because of national crisis management and steering and limitations to regional activities. So, Peter, do you know whether there is already a debate in some cross-border regions about new instruments like citizens' assemblies, and also talking about what happened, that there is also a link to the crisis and the closure of borders?
Well, first of all, I share, I think, the view of Joost. I think it's, of course, it has been national measures, first of all, starting with maybe like this, that separated countries or twin cities, twin towns that have been growing together in the last years. And And especially in the German-Polish border, that was actually a positive effect of the border closures. You saw for the first time, you saw that not only political and economic interdependence is existing between Germany and Poland on a regional level, but also societal interconnections. And that was really nice. That's actually what we analyzed, Martin, in our territorial impact assessment study from last year with Nina and the other colleagues on the Corona crisis that we saw. And we were really surprised that we had several cross-border points in the German-Polish border. And both sides of the border, you saw not civil society, also civil society, but also citizens. So you saw both. You saw a organized civil society and citizens who were separated by their by the border, who actually were commuting on a daily basis, and that was not possible anymore at that time. And they were protesting on both sides of the border. So you had in Frankfurt Oder and in Słubice on the Polish side, you had the same. You had, don't know, some hundred, there were not thousands, but some hundred people, and they showed solidarity, and that was not that visible so far. I think that was really good in the Corona crisis. So that is a positive aspect. For the future, I would say the citizen council and citizen aspects should be one point that should be still fostered. I'm still also after writing this book, of course, there have been mixed pictures, but I'm still a fan of promoting it. But it's only one step. It's one piece of a puzzle. The other one, and that's actually, I think, this year and next year more important, is to foster cross-border public services or agreements for public service, especially in the German-Polish border. As you were mentioning it, Martin, you have good networks in the health sector, but for some political reasons, they did not work. But in the German-Polish border, we have only few health cooperation. We did not have any patient transfer like in the German-French border, for example. So we could see in Alsace and Strasbourg and Kiel, for example. And that's something that needs to be fostered for sure. And what we see that's actually a good thing, is that we have two Rettungsabkommen. I'm not sure how that's called in English.
Emergency agreement. Or...
Emergency agreements that were concluded this year and last year. And these agreements actually have been negotiated for several years, and only the Corona crisis led to the conclusion of these agreements. So you could also see that more integration could happen through the crisis.
I think there, from our Euro region, we can send you a lot of blueprints, because there are many, many emergency protocols with respect to ambulances going across the border, or the fire brigades and things like that. So, and that was such a shame that we already have that, but we don't have that, for instance, for the real pandemic solidarity exchange of patients for the Corona question, for instance. I think we also have to come now to an end to conclude. I would like to thank you all. And in the first place, I would like to ask, is there any urgent question or comment to Peter Ulrich? Still, I think we have tackled a lot of different aspects during 1.5 hours. So if that is not the case, and there is no one who is now raising.
I've just actually, sorry, Martin, I just noted all the comments by Jakub.
Yeah.
I just put it in a Word document because there's so many ideas there.
Yeah, that is all. That is all, of course, also related to the question, what type of instruments, what type of platforms can you create innovative in order to better include citizens in the border region with respect to the decision-making process. So thanks a lot. That was the first episode of Next Item. And of course, that should be a series of more debates where we bring interesting people, interesting research, with panelists together. So we are, of course, now thinking about the next item. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you again then when we invite you for the next event. Have a nice evening.